Hello and welcome to 2021 here on Viking.TV. I'm Anne Diamond, coming to you live from Britain, as always. And as feels like always, we are in total national lockdown again here in the UK, but still trying to be optimistic and looking forward to the spring and summer and hoping that this new year will prove a better one for us all. I hope you had a lovely and peaceful holiday season. Please excuse the Christmas decorations still being up, but after the Christmas that never really was, I am determined to keep the fairy lights twinkling for as long as possible. And anyway, I can't figure out how to get that tree down all on my own. But here we go, it's Thursday again, and as ever, I promise to bring you every week someone absolutely fascinating to meet. And today, well, I want you to meet an astonishing woman who has, in Star Trek parlance, truly gone where no human has ever been before. She has been up there and down there as far as humans can go. She's been a trailblazer her whole life, having gotten into the NASA Astronaut Corps before she received her doctorate at university back in 1978, I think it was. Just look at this footage at her graduation ceremony.
This is 27-year-old Kathryn D. Sullivan, receiving her PhD degree in geology from Dalhousie University, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Kathryn Dwyer Sullivan in geology.
Kathryn Dwyer Sullivan, by the authority vested in me by the Senate of Dalhousie University, I admit you to the degree of Doctor of Philosophy with all the rights and privileges thereto pertaining, and I congratulate you. Dr. Sullivan leaves us to go to NASA, the U.S. Space Agency, to be one of the first women to enter the training course as an astronaut, and we wish you good success.
I think in that case, it wasn't just her own family feeling the pride, but the entire university too. And as was said, my guest went straight into the NASA astronaut program. And if you have a look at this photograph, there she is as part of the first female intake of would-be astronauts in NASA. Quite a few of them household names now. I'm sure you can probably spot on the left there Sally Ride, and Annalie Fisher, who I interviewed not so long ago, who of course is a Viking ship godmother. And there, fourth along from the left, is my guest today. Now, from that early NASA publicity shot, my guest started a hotshot career in space. She flew in the Space Shuttle 3 times. Have a look at this photograph. You'll see her off on her first, when she would become the first American woman to do a spacewalk. And her next mission was the historic launch of the Hubble telescope. More of that later in the book that she's just brought out. And then just last year, in April 2020, so less than a year ago, she achieved another huge first for womankind. She sank to the deepest depths of the Earth's oceans, as deep down as airliners fly above our heads. So her remarkable career literally knows no bounds. And she says she'd gladly do a John Glenn and go back into space now as a more mature person, if you like, in the interests of science. So please meet astronaut and oceanographer extraordinaire, Dr. Kathryn D. Sullivan, joining us from her home in Columbus, Ohio. Kathy, hi.
Hi, Anne. So great to be with you.
Oh, it's lovely to talk to you, and I'm very honoured because you have been the first in so many situations. I just wonder, though, how being the first in a sort of lockdown is affecting you.
Well, we all have tremendous company in the lockdown, don't we?
How has it? I mean, it's interesting that you did that dive in April when the rest of the world was sort of just coming to grips with how it was going to cope with the pandemic. Meanwhile, your mind was on altogether different things, going right down to the very deepest point of the ocean.
Yeah, it was a touch later than that, actually. It was June. I'd received the invitation to join Victor Vescovo in November of 2019. So, come March, as the virus started chasing us all around, the dates and all the plans for the expedition began to get, as you would expect, very fluid. I spent March and April and much of May wondering if it would be just, a dream that evaporates because of the tremendous circumstances the world was grappling with. But Victor and his team put on, all of the right protocols, really over the top on care and caution aboard ship and during our travel out there. We all got tested for the virus so we could arrive in Guam, where the ship was in port, with certification that none of us were carrying the virus. And went directly from the airport out to the ship, which was clean of the virus. And so we basically quarantined aboard ship and just took very good care to go swiftly and cleanly through the airports on our way out there and back. And,
well, I was going to say, you did literally create your own bubble, didn't you?
We absolutely did. It was a bubble of 46 people. And then, of course, the dive itself was a very teeny tiny bubble of just 2 going down and back in the limiting factor submersible.
And this, tell me about this. Well, tell me about the whole dive, really. But the submersible, this is this extraordinary mini sub, most people would call it, that can go to these incredible depths. Is it something like 35,000 feet?
It's closer to 36,000 feet, just shy of that. Yeah. No, it's an extraordinary thing that really is the vision and the creation of one man, an investor and an adventurer, Victor Vescovo, who, as he was in the course of climbing the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents, scratched his head and said, well, wait, why isn't there a matching adventurous record of reaching the deepest points in all the oceans? Earth has highs and lows. And as he started researching, he discovered there were 2 principal reasons. One was no one really quite knew the geography accurately enough to pinpoint exactly where in the Pacific and Indian and Atlantic and Arctic these deepest points were. You knew where the deep trenches were, but some of them are 1,500 miles long. So where in that stretch is the actual deepest point, in at least 3 cases, wasn't known. And secondly, there was no craft that could take anyone that deep. No craft really that could take people below maybe 20,000 feet roughly. Well, most people would say, oh, well, too bad. And Victor said, well, couldn't there be? And carried on commissioning the design and construction of this one-off craft. He wanted it to not just be capable of getting him there once for the purpose of adventure, but to be able to go repeatedly and reliably so that you could open these deepest parts of the ocean to further scientific study. Then he had to go find a ship that could carry it around because his goal was to get to each of these 5 places. And they're seriously far apart. So you need some mothership that can move you from place to place. And then finally, since this part about we don't know really where they are, he had to equip the mothership with the kind of deep sea mapping sonar that would let you pinpoint them. So you see here on the left, the mothership, which he bought in surplus and fitted out for this very special set of operations. And in the foreground, that little submarine, it looks kind of like an overstuffed pillow if you see it out of the water. And it, slides vertically down. We were happily ensconced inside that, inside a basically 5-foot diameter titanium sphere. The walls of that sphere are about 3.5 inches thick because that's the kind of strength it takes to keep outside, the 8 tons per square inch of pressure that you'll be underneath at the bottom. So we're sitting here today on this call with a pressure around us that we call 1 atmosphere. Yeah. And let's just leave it at that. Some people measure it in millimeters of mercury and others in inches. It doesn't really matter. But we have 1 atmosphere here. If you get to the very bottom of the Marianas Trench, just outside your viewport, there are 1,100 atmospheres. It's the equivalent of
100 times what we are experiencing.
1,100 times. So it's basically 8 tons per square inch. So my favorite metaphor is take a large hippopotamus, perch her on 1 stiletto heel, and put 1 of them on every inch outside the submersible.
Eek.
Yeah.
I know we'll get a lot of questions from people saying, well, okay, what's more frightening? You've been out in space where if something went wrong, you could be exposed to freezing, dark, cold nothingness. And alternatively, on the very bottom of the ocean, anything went wrong, you would be exposed to 11,000 times.
1,100.
1,100. You'd be squashed like a bug on a windscreen. What's more frightening?
Well, if you haven't done your sums right, these are lethal environments. And the experience of being able to go there in a spaceship or a mini sub, I liken it to being very fanciful here. They are like magic school buses. They take you to places that physically you can't just nonchalantly go. There's, of course, nothing magic about it. It's careful design and engineering. It's getting all the sums and the math right, and it's lots of testing and care. I'm as much an engineer as a scientist, so I take a good look at those risks. For me, if it was just go there so you could say you had gone, that's not a proposition that's worthwhile. But to go and be able to learn and help open the frontiers of knowledge, that's a purpose I can support. And I'm willing to take some risks to advance that purpose. Measured risks and carefully assessed risks. But
how long does it take to sink down that 36,000 feet?
Well, that will depend on the shape of your submersible or your mini sub. And in the case of limiting factor, it's 4 hours. So it's a 4-hour, very serene sort of elevator ride. Once you get below where the waves are sloshing you about, it's very smooth. It's fairly quiet inside. There's a background noise of some pumps and fans. Victor and I chit-chatted on the way down. We checked in with the surface every 15 minutes to just check in that things were fine. At about 34,000 feet, 33,000 feet below sea level, we ate our tuna sandwiches so we wouldn't have hunger pangs on the bottom, because who doesn't eat lunch at 34,000 feet below sea level? Yeah. And then we reached bottom and went maneuvering along for a while.
Of course, that's the other difference as well. Once you're up in space, I gather when you see out, there's nothing but stars. It's so much more starry than anything we see on Earth. But deep down in the ocean, isn't it total blackness apart from what you can light up?
That's exactly right. So in a spacecraft, when you look back at Earth, for example, you can see roughly 1,000 miles in every direction. And you're right, if you turn the cabin lights off and get your eyes very deeply dark adapted, you definitely see more stars than you would on Earth. But to me, I felt like the star field I saw from orbit was not so wildly different than star fields I had seen high in the mountains off on a big camping trip. But on the other hand, when I looked back at Earth, it was Earth like I never had seen it before, with that 1,000-mile vista and full continents on display out your window in a glance, full hurricanes. You see the scale and dynamics of how the ocean moves and how the atmosphere moves. You see vividly how interconnected it all is, which we tend to not think about. We think about we have a storm or we're going to the ocean or we're going hiking in the mountains. We don't think about and really experience all the ways in which those environments interact and are interconnected. But it's those interactions and interconnections that actually make the world we live in. And it becomes so much more apparent when you look down from a spacecraft.
Well, the one thing you can't see, of course, when you look down from the spacecraft is what's happening in the ocean, certainly on the ocean floor. So when you go down in the submersible, what can you see there? Are there all sorts of strange animals and fish?
Well, I would say they're exotic ones because they're tailored and adapted and attuned to the environments they live in, which are, as we've been touching on, very unique ones. We'll show you one here, I think, on the left. The blue and silver and orange structure you see is one of our automated robotic scientific packages that we put on the bottom with each dive to take.
Are we looking down now onto the seafloor?
Yes, so you're looking down from the top of this robotic lander package, and you see the lander itself on the right. That's everything that's silver and blue and orange. And you might see a little white dot now right about the middle of the frame.
Yes, moving
up towards you. When this package hit the bottom, apparently it disturbed or maybe even woke up this little critter. This is a small organism, probably about 4 inches long, called a polychaete. We would know it as a bristleworm. And you might notice the way it moves is by undulating its entire body. Those little feathery things you see are probably feeding tentacles. And I don't know if we can run it one more time, but you might have noticed as it came up into the close-up, you could see through it. It's translucent, transparent. But there's this yellow stuff inside of it. You're actually seeing its stomach and its intestines. So it doesn't make much biological sense if you live in the deep, cold dark to spend a lot of energy making pigments, coloration.
Yeah.
Here it comes again.
Yeah.
Yep. So I think we woke this guy up. and he had the good grace to swim right up through our camera, so we got a good look at him.
Do we know whether he would have had any eyes? Would he know that he was experiencing light for the first time?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer. There you get a good look at the yellow bits inside. That's a fabulous question, Anne, and I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with polychaetes in general or this particular variant. Most of the organisms down here don't have what we would call eyes, but some of them have photoreceptors, so they would get a stimulus signal if there was any kind of light. But some of the photoreceptors are tuned to wavelengths of light we don't use, because the light we use is only there in the 4 hours that we visit, and then it goes away again.
So here we go with that phrase that's so commonly used when we watch nature documentaries, is that we actually, I don't know if you would agree, we know more about outer space than we do about deep sea in our own Earth.
I would certainly agree we know more about other planetary bodies, like in particular the Moon and Mars, than we do about our Earth and our ocean. The rest, if the maps we could look at that show the topography of Mars or the Moon are, I'm picking this number a bit out of the air, but I would say on the order of 400 times better than the topography we have of the seafloor of our own planet. The other difference is the ocean is the largest habitable volume on our planet. It is the volume in which most of the life of this planet actually lives. And we definitely know perilously little about all of the life forms and all the interactions and the ecology that makes it all work.
That reminds me of a phrase I've heard you use before, which is that we humans, we think we live on an Earth planet. We don't. We live on an ocean planet, don't we?
Yes, it's not original to me, but it's been said before. Yet our planet is very badly misnamed. It should not be named Terra. It should be named Aqua.
Oh, I love it. Try and get that changed, though. Yeah, look, one of the first things you did when you returned from that amazing dive, which was how long, was that you rang, didn't you have a phone call with some of the members up on the crew up on the International Space Station?
We did. I had not overlapped with any of the 3 Americans that were on the station at the time. I knew the wife of one of them. And I really just thought it would be a good giggle, both for us and for them. So rather than go through NASA officialdom, I sent an email to my friend, the flight engineer's wife, and said, do you think the guys would find this fun? We actually had thought about trying to make the connection while we were on the bottom.
Yes.
But if when you send a radio signal from the surface ship down to the submarine, it takes 7 seconds. It takes longer for that broadcast to reach the submarine than it would take for your signal to reach the moon, because of the way sound moves through water. So and then the timing didn't work with their work schedule and ours. So we settled for a phone call, but that's pretty okay. A phone call from the middle of the Pacific Ocean to the International Space Station. And I really had a hard time telling who was having more fun with it, me or the guys on board.
Yeah. Having been just to the very bottom of the Earth in a way, or at least as much as we know, it is quite historic. And it makes you the most, this is extraordinary, the most vertically traveled person on Earth, doesn't it?
It does, yes. And in fact, Guinness World Records has certified that. The language I use on this little memento coin that I've had made up is most vertical person. They have a slightly more cumbersome phrase that wouldn't fit on the coin. But yes, on the right-hand side, you see a figure of the Space Shuttle and the altitude that I flew in the Hubble Space Telescope deployment mission in 1990, which is the highest shuttle mission on record. Yes, and then the depth and the date for our deep dive with an outline of the limiting factor on the right.
I tell you, the other thing that I find interesting is that you're not the most vertically traveled woman, you are the most vertically traveled person, because a lot of your previous records, and you have several, is marking the fact that you're the first woman to do this, you're the first American woman to do this. But here you are you're the first person, which I don't know, does that mean something extra?
Well, I think it's quite fun to have very, very good fun. Now, of course, the 12 gentlemen that had the good fortune, or the 18 that had the good fortune to travel to the moon, can make a different claim. But I would argue that that's a different record, because you went to staying in the Earth environment is one thing, but leaving Earth altogether, fair, and I know and respect all those guys, but we'll put you in a different category. I'll take this one.
Yeah, and it's amazing to be able to combine this interest in space and deep sea. That's something that John Glenn, famously the first American man in orbit, and later, of course, the oldest man in space, he said to you, and I think where you inaugurated into the NASA Hall of Fame, is that when he said it? He acknowledged not just your work as an astronaut, but your devotion to earth sciences. And this is what he said. I thought everybody would like to hear this. He said, there may be no better way to appreciate the earth than to leave it, to look back on the beauty and fragility of our planet from the vantage point of space. Only a tiny fraction of humanity gets that opportunity. So when someone does it, and also happens to be one of the smartest people around when it comes to earth sciences, it's good to have her on our side, especially in challenging times. And then he went on, he said, Kathy is not just an ivory tower scientist. She was part of NASA's first class of female astronauts, selected in '78 and went on to fly 3 shuttle missions. She is the first American woman to walk in space and served aboard the mission that deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. That role in helping humanity look outward has not prevented her from looking homeward. The planet is suffering increasingly severe upheavals, at least partly as a result of climate change. I believe my good friend Kathy is the right person for the right job at the right time. How did you feel when he said that?
Oh, John was such a gentleman and wonderful person. It's such a privilege to have gotten to know him and Annie as friends. It was not the first time he was congratulatory and gracious towards me. Just a gem of a person. But yes, I was probably 10 years old, I think, when he first orbited the Earth. And to even find myself in his company as a colleague, 20 some years later was astonishing. And then to get those gestures, those words of respect and support from him, it was a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And here you are talking to us from your home in Ohio. He is a fellow Ohioan.
That's right.
Is Armstrong, you were just telling me.
That's right. Ohio lays claim to quite a number of astronauts who cite the state as their home state. It's a point of pride, absolutely, across all of Ohio. But John and Neil are the standout stars. There's no question about that.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that your book, Handprints on Hubble, sings the praises of many of your heroes from NASA, and they're not always the most identifiable to us. They're particularly the story of the engineers, who are, I guess, a lot in many ways the brains behind everything you guys were able to achieve. Yeah. So let's go back to how you even started on your career path, because I know your father was an engineer. And you do tell a lovely story I heard you tell once about Sputnik, when you must have only been a couple of years old. And your father, didn't you? You went outside in the garden to see if you could see Sputnik go overhead.
Yeah, I think I was about 4. Well, yes, about right. 5, maybe 5. And my father was an aerospace engineer paying attention to all of the great events in space. And, all that I really knew, I think, was that something big had happened that had captured the grown-ups' attention and some anxiety about it. Yeah. An odd mix of excitement and anxiety. And after supper one evening, we were living in New Jersey at the time. I remember my father took my brother and I out on the front lawn of our little tiny apartment. And I suppose we looked up, and I can't remember if we saw Sputnik or not. What I take from that time was that awareness of, being the excitement of being with my dad as he was trying to show us something so very exciting. So it was really that moment of togetherness, discovering and learning and experiencing something with your parent, which was, that's what sticks with me. And that's really what both my parents were extraordinarily good at doing, but particularly my father. And it particularly mattered, I think, for me as a young girl, that he was unaffected and even-handed and brilliant at letting both me and my brother be his partners, his co-learners, his co-doers, his co-explorers, and everything he did. And obviously with careful guardrails and giving us, small bits of it that suited it to the age we were. But he let us be explorers and learners and discoverers from the earliest age. He let us build answers with him. He didn't just pronounce answers to us and show off his knowledge and wisdom. And I credit so much of what I've been able to do and how I've been able to tackle the world to that kind of parenting. That the metaphor I use is it's like having a personal trainer, that he started from a very weak state and helped train up all my muscles of curiosity and inquiry and how to think things through, how to build an answer to something or make sense of something you'd never encountered before, as opposed to just recoil from it and shy away from it.
Yeah, because
so
too. My father was an engineer too, and we had a hamster called Sputnik. So clearly, somewhere along the line, we were going along the same way. And then, of course, came the moon landing. And I know that I remember you saying this as well, that there was something about the moon landing when they were very, very close to actually landing on the surface. And you heard Buzz Aldrin say something, and your questioning mind started to think, ooh, it's not as obvious as everybody thinks. Something else is going on here. Do you remember that story?
I do. I remember sitting, I think, this far away from the television. I can't remember who else was in the room with me. Maybe our whole family, maybe nobody. None of the world existed except me and that television set at that moment, and listening intently to every word. And it's a two-part story, really. First, I remember hearing Buzz call out some sequence of numbers, and it was something like 6 forward, 4 down, 5 forward, 3 down. And after a few times, I realized he's telling Neil how fast they're going forward and how fast they're going down. And Neil clearly has some sense of what those numbers ought to be. And Buzz is letting him look out the window and call the numbers off to him instead of look at the gauges. That felt like this. It was so thrilling to think I had deciphered or recognized some part of what was happening in such an extraordinary, exotic event that I really knew nothing about. But I had that realization, and it was like a major discovery. And then a couple minutes later, I guess, they're now very close to the ground and coming to the moon and coming pretty well straight down. And I heard Buzz say, "Contact light." And in a flash, I realized, cars back then used to have a little spring about a foot long that would poke out off the side of the car near where you would step out. And as you were getting close to a curb, to prevent you from scraping your wheels along the curb, this thing would start buzzing. It was called a curb feeler. It would tell you when you were close to the curb and didn't want to run your wheels up on it. And so in a flash, it dawned on me that, holy cow, these guys had the foresight to put a curb feeler on the module. There's something sticking straight down, and they know exactly how long that something is. And when it gets pushed on a little bit, it lights up a light. And whatever their gauges and instruments are saying, they now know they are exactly this far off the surface. Yeah. And it was how brilliant, and I wonder how they figured that out. But again, with that enveloping sense of, I figured something out. Wow, it was just an extraordinary feeling for a 17-year-old, just not quite 17-year-old girl who was just finishing high school and was planning to go study languages. That I could suss out something like that was just an amazing.
It's the clicking of an engineer's brain, isn't it? But I gather that even as a little tiny girl, given a doll's house, you weren't very interested in the dolls, but you were interested in the house.
Yes, I was always interested in building and doing. I was in the United States, we would call it tomboy. I wanted to try things and do things and see if I could figure things out. And I mean,
it's a beautiful photograph of you, by the way, isn't it?
Thank you.
It's absolutely gorgeous.
I didn't ever have very many dolls. I had a very large collection of stuffed animals, and I had stories and imaginings about all of them. But my preferred thing to do was not sit with other young girls and imagine tea parties. It was to go do things, and try things and build things. Skateboards were just coming about in Southern California in my early teen years. I couldn't afford one, but I got a piece of wood and started working to build one. And my dad, of course, chipped in eventually and helped me. So I ran around for however many years on an absolutely non-typical and not very fancy skateboard, but I had built it.
But you built it yourself, absolutely. Mind you, there's a lovely, even earlier picture of you, I think, on a spaceship roundabout, which might have shown an early inkling of what you would later become. But in the end, you didn't sort of think of going into space. You went into earth sciences. You read at university, and there later on we saw you getting your doctorate there in geology. Were you ever thinking at that point of maybe becoming a payload specialist, as they call it, on a shuttle?
Well, no is the short answer. And there really, I hadn't been thinking about becoming a mission specialist. I was thinking about, my aims were always much broader than any label. I wanted some path in life that let me have the kind of adventurous and inquisitive life I had watched Jacques Cousteau and the early astronauts have, or that I read about as a young British Foreign Service officer in James Michener's Caravans. Those lives all looked so much more interesting and enticing to me. You know, my father put on a suit and tie and drove down the road, and I now know he did tremendously fun, creative engineering design, but that looked very dull to me, the outward bit of it. So what I wanted was, the way I put it at the time, was I have to find a way that somebody buys me airplane tickets so I can get to explore this planet and learn about it. I want to know about its cultures and its landscapes and its peoples and its languages and everything about it. And how do I get to do that in an active way, not just reading about it? And I'm not being facetious. Really, you know, I need to find a way someone buys me airplane tickets was the best way I could explain the driving force. So the through line, the constant line in my career has been this wide and deep curiosity about our planet and how it works. And I first thought learning languages would be the key to getting that kind of life.
You have university languages, don't you? It's just something you've always known. You have a flair for languages.
I do, and I've capitalized on it. And it's despite the change in professional course, it's been a joy and a delight and a real help in countless ways. When I got to university, intending to read languages, I was required to take several natural science courses my first year, and that's when I discovered geology and oceanography. And I could see in the lives of these dynamic young professors that were lecturing us, you know, I saw the same kind of life I had been looking for. I don't think I had ever had any idea what a geologist or an oceanographer did up to that time, except by watching Jacques Cousteau, I suppose. But here was a real one that was doing real science and real things. And they were both, I guess, like my dad, very approachable young professors. So instead of, you know, I mean, how many fully credentialed professors do you know who would do other than sneer at a 17-year-old French major, first year university, who comes up to them and says, I think what you're doing is fascinating. I'd love to know more about it. Maybe I want to be one. I think 98% of them would poo-poo that and tell her to, you know, get thee back to the French department, dear. But these young guys just leaned right in and said, oh, great, what else are you interested in? And opened their laboratories to me. And instead of showing me what kind of chasm there was between my young, naive self and their august presence, they showed me how to build a bridge and cross that chasm and take a look on the other side.
Yeah. And that building the bridge has stayed with you, no doubt about that. So as we talked about earlier, there you were getting your doctorate, already knowing that you'd got a place at NASA. And there you are in the lineup of the first female intake, all of whom have household names. Can you talk me through them, actually? It is Sally Ride there on the left, isn't it?
That is Sally Ride on the left. And interestingly, when we, none of us, well, I had certainly not met any of them before. I think one or two of them had been together in some publicity events before we all actually showed up to take up our jobs. But when we showed up in Houston to get acquainted and sign in, Sally and I discovered we had briefly overlapped in the same school during first grade in Southern California, just as my family moved out to Southern California. So Sally grew up in the same little valley outside of Los Angeles that I did, went down far enough apart we went to different schools, and of course went off to Stanford and became a physicist. Next to her is Judy Resnick, a native of Akron, Ohio, so a couple hundred miles northeast of where I currently live. Judy was an electrical engineer and very accomplished pianist, and when selected was working with an aerospace company in Southern California. Next to her, as you point out, is Anna Fisher, who's godmother to Viking Orion. Yep.
Yes, right.
And rightly and wisely loves that role. Anna was an emergency room physician, married and living and working with her husband in hospitals in Southern California when she was selected. Then there's me, and to the furthest on the right in the light blue flight suit is Ray Seddon. Ray is a physician and surgeon from Tennessee, who was, I think she was perhaps still in her residency at the time that she was selected. And missing from this picture, because she hopped off to the showers more quickly than the other 5 of us, is Shannon Lucid. Shannon's a PhD in biochemistry from Oklahoma. So she was the wise woman of our group. Sally and I were both straight out of grad school, just over 26 years old. Our first full-time job was astronaut.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's high flyers, it's such an understatement. But all of those names mean something to me, and I'm a Brit. I can only imagine what they mean to Americans. First into space, of course, was Sally Ride. Right. Then when you went up on your first mission, you went with her, and it was the first time ever a mission had 2 female astronauts on board, obviously. Yes, it was. And of course, you could just imagine some people holding their breath to see if it would all come apart when you put 2 of them together at the same time. What's it like actually being a woman in a man's world? Because NASA up till that point must have been very much a male world. Well, it was, but so had been oceanography and geology. So I think all of us, as we compared stories over the years, Shannon was a groundbreaker in her fields of biochemistry research, and had horror stories to tell in comparison to any of the treatment I think the rest of us had received. I was commonly the first or only woman in geology field camps or aboard oceanographic research vessels, and you'd get these perpetual and perennial questions and bits of resistance about, well, I don't have any place for you to change your clothes. Sweetheart, I can figure out where to change my clothes. That's not your problem. There's nowhere for you to go to the bathroom. Any tree will do. This is fine. I don't know what I'll tell my wife. You tell her you have a colleague who's going out in the field. So there were these, my social world will shift and I don't know what to do with it. I won't be able to swear and run around. One guy actually said this to me. We kind of like to just hang around camp in our underwear or skivvies and, be ribald if we want. And, we won't be able to do that if you're here. I said, A, you can do whatever you want if I'm here. And B, again, that's not my problem. Yeah. And I can imagine that it wasn't very long before they started to see you all as professionals rather than women, because you were such amazing professionals. So tell me what it's like. It doesn't matter how many simulations and how much training you must go through when you actually experience takeoff in the shuttle and you go up there into space and you experience, you are literally breaking the boundaries of Earth. You experience weightlessness, all of those sunrises and sunsets as you orbit. What's it like? Before we go there, can we go back to the picture that just flashed up for a moment? Mm-hmm. Let's see if we can get back. And I'll tell you, it's one of the illustrations, figures from my book. And I would love to share, this is a favorite, you never knew this story before moment that I tell about in the book. Because that's you and Sally Ride, isn't it? That's me and Sally Ride. And so Anne, what would you say is happening in this picture? You are both looking at your watches, so I would say you are synchronizing your watches. Very good. Let me tell you what's really happening here. The way the seating arrangements worked in the space shuttle, Sally and I were the last 2 to get aboard. You can see the hatch of the space shuttle just behind Sally's shoulder. Yeah. So we're waiting to get aboard, and of course there are cameras everywhere, so every bit of movement's being watched. And this goes on just long enough. We look at each other a little sheepishly and think, whoa, here we have the first American woman to fly in space and soon to be the first American woman to walk in space. And they're doing nothing useful, just standing around. We probably ought to look like we're doing something useful. And the thought flashes through our minds. Everyone synchronizes their watches before a big mission. We should look like we're synchronizing our watches. So we are pretending to synchronize our watches. And what we're actually saying to each other at this moment is something like,
how much longer do you think we can stretch this out? I wonder what the news anchors are saying.
Oh, and you know, for years we've been so impressed with that photograph of you synchronizing watches. What a terrible disillusionment now.
What we particularly loved is when we got back to Earth and all the news clippings had been saved up for us. That picture was everywhere on countless front pages, and the caption without fail read in very momentous tones, Kathy Sullivan and Sally Ride synchronized their watches before launching on the space shuttle. And we thought, victory is ours.
Yes. Yes. Well, of course, you had to deal with the press. You had to deal with the fact that whether you liked it or not, you were stars.
Well, you are on all the time.
Exactly, and that must have. I mean, you look at your first spacewalk. Your first mission was your first spacewalk. I can only imagine. Like I said, it doesn't matter how much simulation and how much training you go through. The sheer experience must be mind-boggling. But also knowing that every pair of eyes on the planet is probably watching you.
Yeah, but the art form there is just as any athlete would know, and countless other people in high stakes professions. You have to be in the moment, right, completely absorbed with what's before you to do. You can't be paying attention or thinking about the people in the galleries, the people in the bleachers, the people on the sidelines. In a sense, we all have audiences watching bits of our daily life who will form an opinion and maybe voice an opinion. And if that's what you're focused on, you won't do or be the best that you can do. So, yeah, I credit to the experiences I'd had. Again, as I said, always the tomboy, on a high school softball field, getting that realization that I can't play as well as I want and need to play if I'm listening to this, or if I'm thinking mostly about that. You've got to be fully engaged in the moment and in the things that are in your hands to do. And it's another one of those muscles I think you build starting with smaller experiences at younger ages. And you may have a natural bent in that direction, but you can build on and strengthen those muscles as well.
You must also, though, be able to enjoy it, mustn't you? I mean, being out on that spacewalk and looking around you and looking down at Earth and realizing where you are, surely you must take some time out to enjoy that moment.
I think we all cherish the moments, especially on a spacewalk, where the choreography of things lets you pause for a bit and stop being 200% attentive to your tools or your hands or what you're doing, and lean back or step back or pivot around and take in where you are. Our spacewalk was only 3.5 hours long, which is quite short compared to many. So we didn't have very many moments like that, but we did get a couple. This scene shows one of those times we were not doing that. That's Dave Leesma with his back to you and the American flag on it, and me slightly off to the left. And this is sort of right in the middle of the procedure we were doing on this model of a satellite fueling system to prove that the specialized tools that we had built actually worked, and you could connect a fuel line to a satellite and refill its fuel tanks. It had never been done before on orbit. It actually still has never been done on orbit, but it was one of the things that the shuttle was designed to do. The shuttle was meant to both deliver satellites to orbit, but also to be able to retrieve them and bring them back down for refurbishment or upgrade, or to repair or refuel them in place. So those 3 R's, retrieve, repair, refuel, were ones that we were all intent on demonstrating via real shuttle missions in 1984 and 85.
And of course, that mission, as we said there, made you the first American woman to ever walk in space. Second mission, was that the Hubble telescope mission?
That's right. Second was Hubble. Yep.
Right. And that too, I mean, how historic. And as you said earlier, Hubble is in a very high orbit, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very large spacecraft. It's roughly a London double-decker bus minus the upper deck, basically, quite large. And then it has these very large solar wings that unfold. So, there's a lot of, even though it's very high up, there's always going to be a lot of drag on Hubble that we're trying to pull it back down. And it does not have any kind of rocket thruster. It holds itself still with gyroscopes, all of which is to say, if you're going to put something very large and very, huge up in orbit and you want it to hold very still, you need to get it way up there where there's very, very, very little atmospheric drag, and not so much. You could easily overwhelm the gyroscopes if it got too deep into the atmosphere. So that was what drove us to take it up very high. And the other thing was, as it turns out, it was going to be put into orbit in 1990 when the sun was at the peak of one of its cycles. And when the sun goes into its active cycle, our atmosphere actually inflates a little bit. So you have more density higher up. And that put even more of a premium on taking Hubble very, very high up so that the drag wouldn't disturb it.
And unfortunately, of course, what a lot of people remember about that launch is that once we got Hubble up there, it wasn't working quite right. What was that all about?
Well, yes, billions of dollars and decades later, you have this extraordinary telescope on orbit, and it turns out it can't see clearly. As one famous line, I think it was in Popular Mechanics magazine, said, it was as if an eagle had turned into a bat. So the image on the left here of a spiral galaxy shows you what Hubble was able to see with the original mirror. And the mirror had been carved basically to the wrong shape. Not by a lot. If you pluck one strand of hair out of your head and cut that into 25 slices, it's one of those slices, which sounds astonishingly small, but it's well within the performance limits that mirror makers should be able to do. So that was the bad news. You screwed up. The good news was they had screwed up very precisely. And so just like your eye doctor can calculate the difference between what your eye is and what it should be, the opticians were able to calculate the difference on Hubble. And instead of going up and repolishing that big mirror, which would have been impossible, the engineers came up with a clever way to insert into the light train a set of mirrors that would intercept the bad light, bounce it back and forth a few times, and turn it into good light. That's the simplest way to explain it. So that the big mirror on Hubble, even today, produces bad light. But as all the instruments have been upgraded and replaced with higher performance ones over the years, each of those newer models has had the eyeglass prescription built into it. And so Hubble now sees, in fact, it actually sees better now than the image on the right.
Yes,
that
it does,
immediately after the first repair in 1993, and electronics and detectors and everything have continued to improve since then. Hubble's probably 1,000 times better telescope today than it was when we put it in orbit in 1990, because of that ability to repair it and upgrade it while it was in orbit.
Exactly, and that's the miracle of its engineering, I suppose, because when you wrote your book, that's what you sort of you evoked, that handprints of Hubble on Hubble. Can you tell us why you called it that?
Yeah, there are a couple strands to that story. One is, as all the really high drama servicing mission spacewalks happened, I think that the role that our deployment crew and Bruce McCandless and I played in establishing the tools and equipment for those spacewalks kind of faded to background, and rightly so. Our job was lay a foundation, and the crews that came after us had to build on that and make it all work. So as that happened, I began to hear myself saying, and whenever I've been asked what of all the things I got to do in my NASA career, is there one particular thing that stands out I'm proudest of or get most satisfaction from, it's always been Hubble. And the way I came to express that was every discovery Hubble has brought home and turned in, I feel like I have a fingerprint on it. I played a part, not one that's among the highly celebrated, but I played a part. And as I was thinking about working on this book with a colleague from the Smithsonian, she commented, well, there are actually handprints on the outside of Hubble now, and John Grunsfeld took a picture of them on the final spacewalk, and you see that on the left here. These are places where the gloves of those repair mission astronauts scuffed the outside of the telescope and gets bombarded by all the ions and particles in outer space. It weathers a little differently where they scuffed it. And so I took my metaphor of I have a fingerprint on every discovery and morphed that into handprints. It's a better alliteration in a literary sense, and it tied into the photograph. But the other reason I chose that title was because of these engineers who are like the hidden figures of the Hubble story. They are really the reason it all was able to work. from the guys that conceived of the way to design it to the guys, and it was almost all guys, men, that designed and developed all the tools that all those repair missions used. They really, and trio of them stayed with Hubble from 1985 till 2009. They bent their career to stick with Hubble at some jeopardy to their own professional well-being. But they were the mainstays of Hubble and really the reason it's working. And their story deserved to get into the foreground and not be lost.
Yeah, and they must have been people you worked very closely with, because in many cases they made tools to actually fit your gloved hands. They had to be that practicable, didn't they? And yet we don't know their names. We know your names, but we don't know their names, and it's really it's lovely that you have paid tribute to them in that way. But it goes right back to your dad's engineering and everything, doesn't it?
Totally, very, very much. Yeah, but to work in a spacesuit or do a spacewalk and repair Hubble. I mean, imagine putting on 2 bulky snowmobile suits, double pair of gloves, and 2 motorcycle helmets. And that still falls short of the reality of working in the suit, but it'll give you a sense of it. And then, by the way, if you make a mistake and don't pay attention to your tool, it doesn't fall to your feet; it floats away.
Yes, and that's happened too, hasn't it?
Yes, once or twice.
Your final mission was with Discovery, and I've got some pictures of you with Discovery where you're obviously not in space. Is Discovery now on display or something?
Discovery is on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. She flew the final shuttle mission, and somewhere around 2015, she's displayed with the cargo bay closed as if she has just landed at the Kennedy Space Center. And of course, as you go out there as a visitor, you don't usually get inside at all. But this day came about when the Smithsonian was going to let some curators from another museum have access to Discovery for some of their program purposes. And the same friend who encouraged me to write the book gave me a quick little semi-secret phone call and said, any chance you can be out here at so-and-so a time, because we will have Discovery open. And so they let me get back into Discovery and take a couple pictures. And then a little while later, they invited Charlie Bolden, who was on the Hubble flight with me and went on, of course, to lead NASA during the Obama administration. We got to give everybody a guided 3D tour through Discovery, which you can find online somewhere, I'm sure. I mean, it's this full 3-dimensional camera inside the cargo bay and inside the crew module, with Charlie and me sitting there talking and reminiscing and pointing out the different things that you're seeing around the cockpit.
It's funny, isn't it? All the discovering you've done and the immense miles that you have covered in your voyages. You've always been in some sort of small capsule, haven't you? I mean, quite, limited, but nevertheless, you've achieved remarkable things. Shall we get on to some questions? I've got tons of questions for you.
Oh, yes, please.
Speed through them, I think. I don't know whether this is a cheeky one or not. This is from Captain Brian from Galway in Ireland, who says, hi, Kathy, how did that tuna sandwich at 34,000 feet below sea level compare to the seafood medley on Galway Bay? Does that mean...
it completely means something. Hello, Captain Brian. Well, because of the specialness of the locale, it was a very tasty tuna sandwich, but nothing will beat that ride across the bay that we did together. Let's look forward to another one.
Oh yes, well, in time we will. Did you spend free time socializing with your fellow astronauts, going to dinner, shopping, etc., or did you lead very separate lives? That's from somewhere.
I would say largely separate lives, because we all had different work patterns and assignments and cadences. So we would do office gatherings periodically. Astronauts who happened to go to the same church or have children in the same school would have those sorts of social mechanisms. But it's a very busy, highly mobile work life. So you'd usually sort of get home, go for a run, and crash, I think is probably what almost everybody did.
Okay, another one. John from Holland in the United States says, are you familiar with the NASA-sponsored research project S-Basalt 1 and 2 Finesse and Subsea? Because my daughter is one of the lead geological researchers. Just wondered if you've heard of it.
Well, I'm not familiar with those, and I'll have Anne email me those program titles, and I'll take a look at them.
Yeah, okay, you're on. Roger in the US says, how did you get your first job out of college with NASA? You just applied, didn't you?
Fill out the bloody great long form. Yep.
Yeah, wasn't there a funny thing about the form as well, that it was so government type form that it actually said, give me your career going right back to 1935 or something.
Yeah, it was a United States Civil Service form, Mark I standard civil service form. And I think the 1935 bit was with where have you lived, go back to 1935. And, you know, I had this cheeky moment of thinking, what sort of fake metaphysical comment do I put in about the years 1935 to 1951? But yeah. I decided I would not be snarky on the application.
Yeah, and that probably is served you well. Jay from Stormville in New York says, on the shuttle, there are always experiments of serious kinds going on, various kinds. Do you have that on submersibles too?
We did have, in a sense, the mission purpose for our dives. We did 6 dives altogether on the campaign that I was involved with. I just did the one. But the purpose there was to refine, add detail to the topography of the floor of the Challenger Deep. And so those 3 robotic landers we put down had extra instruments that measure pressure and depth. The submersible had a set of those instruments. And our goal and our plan was to traverse from our landing point past each of those 3 packages, correlate all the instruments, and then redo the calculations and get better depth measurements and better topography. So that was the experiment, if you will, that we were doing on our dives. Other dives have used the unmanned packages without the submersible and put down water sampling bottles to get both genetic and basic chemical information, bits of food, bits of bait on the outside of the lander to try to attract more of the creatures that live at those depths, at least the scavengers, and just kind of try to take a census of, you know, who's down there and how are they living.
Never let an opportunity for research go by. Carmen says, Carmen's in LA, she says, how proud was your father when you told him you were going to space or working for NASA?
Another one of the stories I tell in the book, when I called my parents and let them know I'd been selected before the news broke, I think they were both very proud, but as you perhaps can imagine, it sort of took my mother aback a little bit that, in fact, when I called them when I was going to be interviewed, that's what it was. And my mother's voice cracked a little bit and she said, what exactly does this mean? And I very blithely answered that it meant when I finished my degree, I would either be going 200 miles up or 6,000 feet down in a submersible, because I had already been offered a postdoctoral fellowship to start doing geology in little mini subs. She called the next day to retract the comment and offer her full support, by the way, which is tribute to my mother.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Hugh from the United States says, hi, Kathy, from everyone at Craft Telerobotics.
Hey, Hugh, great.
Yay.
They build the manipulator arm that's on the outside of the limiting factor submersible.
Oh, brilliant. That's wonderful. Leela from Winter Park says, fascinating. What drives you to go on these incredible missions? Does it make day-to-day life on Earth boring?
You know, I characterize myself first and foremost as an explorer, and I just seem to have this, you know, far too boundless and far too varied a curiosity. So, you know, my standard and favorite line is, I wonder. That's interesting. I wonder. So I do love the geographic adventures. You know, the geographic dimension has always been, it's kind of a first love and a first impetus. But, you know, exploring is really just putting curiosity into action. And that can be in quieter ways. It can be through reading. It can be through local neighborhood things. And I nowadays, at least in my maybe slightly saner, wiser years, find both the smaller, quieter dimensions and the larger geographic ones comparably satisfying.
But as I said earlier, you have made it very plain that if there were a John Glenn opportunity, you'd go up into space again.
And if it happened to involve the moon, I would not object.
No, I absolutely don't blame you. I'd follow that. Lorenza from Hemet says, what an incredible career you've had. Do you have a fear of anything?
Well, every astronaut will tell you they harbor a fear of screwing up.
Yeah.
In fact, the line, "Oh God, please don't let me screw up," is known as the astronaut's prayer for a reason. I mean, nothing comes to mind. I think my first response to things around me is a curiosity. I would probably be look first and flee later rather than just flee right away.
Yeah, don't look for a fear too hard. Wallace from Midland in the US says, congratulations on a great career with more to come. My brother is Mark Craig, former deputy director of NASA. You have so many friends watching.
And a long-time dear friend. Thank you so much.
Domenico in the Vatican City says, how long did it take for you to reacquire your perfect functioning in gravity after returning back from space mission?
Yeah, great question. My flights were quite short compared to nowadays. They were 5, 7, 10 days. And even after the 10-day one, and that happened to be the one where doctors were taking careful measurements on me, even after 10 days, I would say within an hour and a half, I was, as according to their measurements, pretty well back at full function. I would say, though, that same landing day becomes a very long day with post-flight physicals and reconnecting with family and getting back to Houston and all those kinds of things. And by the time I flopped into bed on landing days, it was often the case you'd been up the better part of 24 hours. I do remember as I flopped into bed that evening, looking at my arm alongside my face and thinking it felt like it was made out of very wet sand. It was, consciously, how can it be that heavy? Because you haven't felt the weight of your limbs through that time. You're suddenly aware that they weigh something.
Yeah, because all you astronauts, your limbs your arms tend to float like that, don't when you're asleep.
Yes, if next time you're in some swimming pool, take a good breath and close your eyes and hold it. And just go dead man's float. And that posture, slightly bent spine, slightly crooked knees, arms up about like so, that tends to be the neutral posture you'll take if you just fall asleep floating around in zero gravity.
My goodness. Richard in the United States says, as we watch astronauts float within the space shuttle cabin, acrobatic spinning, somersaults, etc., in a tight volume, how many times do you hit your head, feet, ankles and arms? I'm sure it must happen and it must hurt a bit.
Well, the trick is on those little on-camera goofing around bits, sometimes people might get a pretty good rate of spin up. But what you learn very quickly once you get to orbit is you want to go slow like a pro. And so all your motions slow way down. The forces involved slow way down. If with a keen eye, you can always tell rookies on their first few hours in space because they are still fidgeting and flailing around a bit. But, it doesn't happen as much as you might think.
Yeah, I suppose it's more serious than that. You get over all that when you've done the vomit comet. Do they still train astronauts on the vomit comet?
I don't know if they still use the vomit comet. And my argument has always been it's fun, but it's not training because it's not actually, at best, it's 20 to 30 seconds of simulated zero gravity. But what it really is continuously changing gravity. From twice the force of gravity through a moment of neutral gravity to zero gravity for a bit over and over and over again. And that'll give you some golly gee whiz opportunity to feel what it will be like to move around so freely. But it's not really getting underwater, neutrally buoyant, either on scuba gear or in a simulated spacesuit, is far better training. The sustained ability to move around in that way is what really gets you trained, not a momentary flash.
There is a lot of training in scuba, isn't there? And finally, and this almost touches on the same thing, actually, whether any of us ordinary mortals will ever experience that sort of weightlessness. Sean from Houston says, Kathy, as a NASA JSC employee, I want to congratulate and thank you for all your contributions during your NASA career. Your diverse skills and background, I recollect, gave you some very interesting and beneficial viewpoints. With that in mind, as we commercialize human spaceflight, what parallels do you see between spaceflight and commercial river and seacraft industries, such as recreation, education, and commerce? He said, for instance, do you ever see a Viking river cruise in space?
It's not, well, it won't be on a river, certainly, but other than that small detail, it's not beyond believing. I think it's a good ways off because the price points will have to change very radically for it to be a significant market. But it's not beyond believing. The companies that are currently working in that direction, from Virgin to Blue Origin to SpaceX, they need to rack up many, many more successes to show both to regulators and to potential passengers how safe they really are. The prices need to become more accessible to a much larger swath of humanity, I would say. But I could imagine it. I think it's going to be a long ways down the road before it's a significant market. I'm a skeptic on whether it will ever be really a very large demand function, genuinely commercial market, maybe a la commercial airliners today. I mean, the commercial airlines today move prior to the pandemic, move millions and millions of people a day. And so the economics there and the ability for the companies to also help drive improvements in the technology is pretty robust. I think this is going to be a high-end adventure tourism market for quite some time to come, is my take on it.
Some people will pay that price, won't they? It's a bit, It goes back to what John Glenn said about you, is the ability to go up there and look down on Earth and try to understand better our Earth from space. That's quite something. You must have felt that emotion yourself.
I did, and I think every astronaut does, and I think every human that ever has the chance will experience something similar. And it's been given the label the overview effect. But what it really boils down to is what you experience and how your sense of things changes when you see something that you have it in your mind. This is a very familiar thing. You've lived on Earth all these years, and suddenly, very suddenly, you see it from this radically, mind-bendingly different perspective. And it just shatters lots of your standard preconceptions and mental models. It's like a cosmic shift in your underpinnings. I think it leaves everyone feeling a sense of wonder and awe. And those, of course, are powerful forces that can unify humankind. So I think that's part of what brings astronauts home, very often saying, if only everyone could see this, how much of the mischief and mayhem here on Earth would fall away, because we would know better. We would have seen it. We would have realized it. And that comes from that radical shift in seeing this place you live that you think you know quite well, that you suddenly see, you say, oh my goodness, I didn't know it was that. It's a pretty big shift.
I'll bet. Meanwhile, I suppose the rest of us will have to put up with those iconic photographs, like the little blue dot and Earthrise,
Right.
Apollo's Earthrise, and Neil Armstrong's footprint on the moon, and indeed your handprints on Hubble, because they're in the same sort of league, aren't they? It's the effect that man has been able to have on a much wider perspective.
Well, it's lovely of you to put my book in the category of those really cosmically iconic pictures. Thank you.
Well, it's been a wonderful pleasure to talk to, is all I can say. We've been talking for so long, I must let you go. What are you off to do today? Nothing very exciting, I suppose, if you're locked down.
Nothing very exciting. I've got 2 dogs upstairs that desperately need a walk, I'm sure.
Well, I wish you well. Have a wonderful walk. I can't tell you what fun it's been to talk to you. I mean, it really has been incredible. But we wait to hear more from your amazing career. I can only think of what you're thinking up next. So we will wait and see and maybe meet again. But until we do, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. It really has.
Pleasure's all mine, Anne. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And let me just tell everybody who's watching right now, next week here on Viking.TV, it's Norway week. And I'm going to introduce you to the TV chef, Andreas Vistad. I think I've said that right. Actually, Kathy would know how to say it better than me. He has hosted 7 seasons of new Scandinavian cooking broadcast in the US and China, Germany, Italy, Finland, and on BBC Food in over 50 countries since 2003. Actually, if you're watching from America, you probably know him very well. You'll have seen his programs on PBS, of which Viking is actually a very proud sponsor. So until I have the pleasure of your company once again, all I can say is keep safe, keep well, and I'll see you next Thursday. Goodbye.